small individual self-sufficient really came as a shock to me. Now, sort of just to hammer that home, I also found that the top 10% of farms in America in size make up more than 70% of the farmland. This all sort of paints a picture that there really is this monopolization of American agriculture that really I had not appreciated before, and going into this, I never expected to find this extent, this monopoly in my research. Now, the connection to Rome probably seems a bit out there, right? Ancient Rome is civilization millennia old. What connection could it possibly have to our nation's crises today? So I looked at, as I was doing my research through this, I really wanted to tackle something classics-based. This is really my passion. And I was doing my research and I found that there's a natural pattern in the evolution of Rome, which is that you have your birth of the Republic. This is the age when the self-sufficient individual farmer is celebrated as the symbol of the Republic. The political sphere is defined early on, everything takes shape, and all of the political institutions are formed. Now, this also catalyzes the beginning of social inequalities, right? And that continues into the ascension of Rome. When Rome goes from a small city-state to a superpower the likes of which the ancient world had never seen, there is a massive boom in prosperity, a boom in wealth that lines the pockets of the elite classes. The rich get richer, and in turn, these elites pursue their moneyed interests to advance their wealth, advance their power, at the expense of the common farmer and the common individual. And so from this advancement of moneyed interests, the suppression of the common farmer, you get the rise of populism. And what happens in the rise of populism is that as political institutions fail the people, as they fail to act against the growing power of the elite class, because they're made up of the elite class largely, the people will turn to populists who will oppose established institutions because the institutions fail them. They fail to act in their name, they fail to deliver on what the people need them for, and so they will turn to anti-establishment candidates who do not care about established institutions, who will oppose established institutions if it means accomplishing their goals. And so I found this very similar pattern when discussing America. Now, our republic was birthed on the ideas of Thomas Jefferson's yeoman farmer, the individual, self-sufficient, pure Republican example of what the republic should be made of. And so from there, we start as a young nation, 13 colonies. Idea of farming is very celebrated, the small farmer. And yet when America ascends, and both you can talk about that territorially, talk about that economically. Really, I look at the late 19th century and the Gilded Age. When America ascends in its prosperity, it becomes a powerful economic nation, the similar circumstance of the wealthier getting wealthier, of the poor getting downtrodden by moneyed interests advancing, right? That's the robber baron concept of the late 19th century. And so from that, political inactivity in the same sense yields this sense of populism, turning towards anti-establishment that only grows as inactivity continues. And so this sort of really comes to my idea of the roadmap to oligarchy. So as the upper classes gain more wealth and influence, aristocracy advances these moneyed interests, and historically poorer farmers are forced to compete with wealthier elites. This sends them further into poverty and debt. Now, predatory lending, the debt that they accumulate, is actually lended by the elites. The elites are the creditors. And so there's this cycle of wealth that really puts poor farmers at the bottom of the totem pole, unable to continue and survive in the face of elites advancing their interests into agriculture and trying to monopolize that industry. Which here's my final thesis comes to this, the stages of agrarian populism. That as the elites and the aristocracy of both Rome and America advanced towards agriculture, sought to monopolize agriculture, and sought to profit off of agriculture at the expense of the common farmer, you have varyingly you have growingly intense states of populism. And so you begin with regulation. This comes through in ancient Rome, the tribunes of the plebs, and in America, you could talk about the populist movement, began with policy ideas to regulate the elites, limit the amount of acreage they could hold, limit the amount of money or monopolization they can hold. This comes through the Sherman Antitrust Act in America, which famously failed. It also comes through the Sextian Rogations in ancient Rome, which also failed. The second stage is uplifting. When regulation fails, there is a new policy idea to uplift the common people through social programs and government support that will help counteract the power of these growing elites. Now, you can look at this through FDR's New Deal reforms. The Agricultural Adjustment Act very famously did this, providing the catalyst for all of the farming subsidies we have today. And the same thing happened in ancient Rome with a piece of legislation called the Lex Agraria, which was about giving land to the people, uplifting them so they could compete. But this famously fell apart because the established institutions which benefited the elites, which upheld their monopolies over agriculture and upheld their powers, did not vanish with uplifting social programs. It continued to advance against the common individual, which leads to the final stage, revolution. Eventually, when the established institutions fail, the common people will push for a total decimation of those institutions. They will find a candidate who will oppose them directly, be anti-institution even, and do anything necessary to accomplish their goals. Now this really comes in the form of Julius Caesar, who famously established a dictatorship that really spelled doom to the Roman Republic. It never recovered from that dictatorship. It never reemerged as a democratic power from that dictatorship. And we're seeing very similar events today, specifically with what I call Trumpian populism, which is direct anti-establishment, drain the swamp concepts that really oppose the established institutions due to widespread agrarian malcontent or unhappiness. And so from there, that's really the assessment of this is the roadmap that I've found as to where our nation is headed. If we are following this path of the Roman Republic, we're going to turn towards, or the agrarian masses are going to turn towards, increasingly radical populists who will oppose our institutions more and more until, it really paints a picture of doom for our republic, as long as the government remains inactive to support the farming class. Now that's really my thesis there. That's heavy, it took a lot of time, and oh boy, there was a lot to cover. But why I did it is really, that's a whole other question. So I'm very gifted in the fact that I have, despite growing up in one of the wealthiest urban centers, coastal cities in the country, I have been gifted with family in rural America, rural North Carolina. And so I have sort of a foot in both worlds in the sense that I have this other perspective of agrarian connection and what those agrarian masses are experiencing. It allows me to, that sort of empower me to pursue this project. So I was like, I want to really paint a picture of just how divided America is, just how we're ignoring these consequences, just how we're ignoring the dangers that pose to our republic. So this is also, of course, as I mentioned, a natural extension of my personal interests. I'm an avid history enjoyer. I am a Latin student, both concepts I really just enjoy studying. And so this was a chance for me to really look at primary historical sources and pursue my interests to the fullest extent. And now I'm also, I think as I mentioned, I'm growing up in a time of unprecedented political division, specifically between agrarian and urban masses. Now, when I first came in to propose this project with Mr. Brown, the first thing he said is first thing we talked about was electoral differences. Is that this paints a picture that today in America, our political parties are largely divided on these lines of urban versus rural interests and rural versus urban vote. And so that was a serious issue that I just wanted to tackle growing up in this time period. Now, just briefly, I want to say this was my process. That I had three stages of research that I began pouring through traditional, actual, as close as you can get to firsthand history comes to ancient Rome. I spent a lot of time in the Latin room reading Polybius, reading Appian, reading Livy, this was an incredible experience for me to really get involved in the history. And at the same time, I was reading William Jennings Bryan, Thomas Jefferson, to paint this picture of what was really happening with the American Republic. So then stage 2 was when it gets a little more difficult. You have so much information that you find in your research. Finding an argument that is concise, that makes sense, that can really be argued from all of those quotes and data that you found, that was probably the toughest part. Now once I figured that out, and it took a lot of tweaking, I got to my writing and refining, and this was just type, just putting it all out on the page until I had formed a cohesive argument. I mean, it was tons and tons of writing. And so, yeah, so the aftermath to me is that I've gained this newfound appreciation for the state of our nation, the state that divides, that dominated, both from an emotional sense of sympathizing with America's farming base, but also just for understanding the state of our republic. That's the real takeaway, is that I am more fearful for the state of our nation. And that sounds very depressing, but I am, than I was when I started this. But at the same time, I feel like the fact that there are patterns to look at, the fact that we have examples in ancient Rome to look at, we can be informed enough that I think that we can avert this crisis. And that's sort of my takeaway. And looking forward, I want to advance that message and share that message however I can. All right, thank you so much.